began in a setting meant to inspire, a grand concert hall buzzing with anticipation, lights cascading across polished wood, the quiet murmur of elegance hanging in the air. People had come expecting brilliance, perhaps to be dazzled by reputation or entertained by technical mastery. But hidden in the crowd, away from the spotlights and reserved rows, was someone who didn't carry a famous name, didn't come wrapped in years of classical accolades, Karoline Leavitt. She wasn't there to make a scene. In fact, she hadn't even planned to take the stage. She had simply come to observe, to admire, to learn. Music had always been more than just notes for her. It was something that lived in the quiet corners of her soul, something deeply personal. It didn't demand praise. It existed for the sake of expression, of connection, of truth. Yet the atmosphere that night was thick with pretense. There was a certain mood that favored prestige over passion. And Karoline, by her mere presence, uninvited, unassuming, unrecognized, disturbed that current. She wasn't wearing the right designer name. She didn't walk with the practiced confidence of those used to cameras and curated applause. And for that, she became a target of subtle smirks and not-so-subtle commentary. The whispering started small. A glance here, a chuckle there. Her name passed around like a footnote. Questions were asked in tones loud enough to be heard, not to inquire but to exclude. Who was she? Why was she here? The answers didn't matter. The judgment had already arrived. And yet Karoline didn't react. She didn't fight for acknowledgement or attempt to counter the narrative being built around her. There was no need to. She had learned long ago that insecurity dresses itself in mockery, that loud voices are often disguising a fear of being challenged, of being reminded that greatness doesn't need applause to be real. So she listened. Not just to the music, but to the room, to the energy. She absorbed every note, every look, every word that wasn't said but hung heavy in the air. And inside, something began to stir. Not resentment, not pride, but a quiet resolve. She knew her place, not because someone had given it to her, but because she had claimed it within herself long before the world had a say. As the evening unfolded, an unexpected moment came. One of those unscripted pauses in life that seem almost fated. The piano sat alone, momentarily untended. A hush fell. Eyes wandered. And without hesitation, Karoline stood up and walked toward it. There was no announcement, no dramatic flair. Just a calm, steady movement of someone stepping into purpose. Some scoffed. Others whispered again. It was the same song, just another verse. But Karoline didn't hear them. She wasn't there for them. Her fingers found the keys like reuniting with an old friend. And then she began to play. What poured out wasn't rehearsed perfection. It wasn't a competition. It was raw, emotions sculpted into melody. A conversation between heart and instrument. A language that bypassed ego and reputation. It was delicate and powerful all at once. The kind of performance that doesn't demand attention, but quietly takes hold of every listening ear. In that moment, all the noise faded. All the assumptions dissolved. There was no room left for arrogance when honesty walked into the room cloaked in harmony. The melody didn't mock back. It didn't retaliate. It simply told the truth. A truth deeper than applause, richer than fame. A truth that belonged to Karoline alone, and yet, somehow as she played, she gave it to everyone. Karoline Leavitt had never needed to shout to be heard. Her strength wasn't found in confrontation, but in the quiet assurance of someone who knew who she was, regardless of who did or didn't see it. And that night, when the room turned cold with doubt and subtle derision, she didn't rise to the bait. She didn't raise her voice, defend her worth, or offer an explanation for her presence. She simply walked to the piano. The room didn't know what to make of it. The contrast was stark. Here was a young woman in a modest dress, not cloaked in grandeur or theatricality, placing her fingers on the same keys that moments ago had been guarded by legacy and expectation. But there was no tremble in her hand, no hesitation in her step. Only calm, only purpose. For Karoline, Music had always been a sanctuary. It wasn't something she did to impress. It was something she did to feel. As a child, she had sat for hours at an old upright piano, letting the outside world fade as she immersed herself in the quiet, endless universe of sound. She learned to listen more than she played, to understand the space between notes, the silence that shaped the melody. Her connection to music had nothing to do with recognition. It had everything to do with freedom. That night, as the world around her bristled with skepticism, she didn't retreat into fear. She went inward, into that place where music flowed not from theory, but from memory. Her fingers moved without seeking approval. Her eyes didn't scan the audience for validation. Instead, they softened, as if she was remembering something distant and dear. The first notes drifted through the hall like a gentle breeze. It wasn't loud. It didn't command attention, but it drew it, effortlessly. There was something different in the way she played, not just in technical skill, though that was unmistakable, but in intention. Each chord felt chosen, not for effect, but for meaning. She wasn't performing. She was revealing. There's a moment in every truly great musical experience when time seems to stop, when the room, regardless of its size, begins to breathe as one. As Karoline's hands danced over the keys, that moment arrived. The energy in the hall shifted. The conversations halted. Eyes turned. Phones were lowered. It wasn't because she demanded it. It was because she deserved it. People often forget that music is a form of storytelling. And Karoline was telling one without uttering a word. Her story was written in minor keys and hopeful crescendos, in delicate harmonics that rose like whispered confessions. It spoke of quiet battles fought alone, of dreams held tight despite the noise of doubt. It carried the ache of being misunderstood and the courage of showing up anyway. There were no flourishes to impress. No theatrics, just truth, note by note. The piano wasn't a weapon. It was her voice, and through it, she said everything that needed to be said. She answered every sneer with a gentle refrain. She responded to every doubt with clarity wrapped in melody. People began to lean in, their skepticism melting into silence. Some blinked, caught off guard by the emotion welling in their chest. Others sat still, afraid to move, afraid they'd miss even a second of something that now felt larger than the room itself. She had reached them, not by raising her volume, but by raising the standard. What made her playing unforgettable wasn't just the precision. It was the humanity, the way she made every listener feel as though they were being spoken to directly. The way the music wrapped itself around their own hidden thoughts and memories, holding them gently, asking nothing in return. She didn't need to explain her presence. She didn't need credentials, spotlights, or introductions. The piano became her truth-teller, her interpreter. Through it, she offered the world a glimpse into something real, something beautiful, something undeniable. And in doing so, she shifted the entire atmosphere. As the final notes faded into the air, something strange happened. Something unexpected, almost surreal. The grand concert hall, moments ago buzzing with quiet murmurs and the sound of judgment masked as curiosity, fell into a complete and reverent silence. It wasn't the kind of silence born out of confusion or discomfort. It was the kind that arrives only when something sacred has just passed through the room, a kind of stillness that demands reflection. Karoline didn't look up immediately. Her fingers lingered on the keys, not to prolong the moment, but because letting go too quickly would have felt like breaking a fragile spell. She knew what she had done wasn't just a performance. It was a release. A letting go of something deeply held, something that words could never have carried. Her back remained straight, her breath steady, but her heart was still slowly descending from wherever it had gone during that piece. She had played not for recognition, but from remembrance, of the girl who once believed music was her only friend, of the quiet hours she spent learning how each note could hold a different kind of emotion, how sound could sometimes say what her voice never dared to. And now, here she was, standing in a place that wasn't made for her, in front of people who had quietly questioned her right to even be present. and she had given them something no title could have offered. The silence stretched, and for a moment, no one knew quite what to do with it. There was no polite applause, no forced response, just the weight of awe settling in. It was as if the entire room had been caught off guard by something far more authentic than they had anticipated. People who had spent a lifetime measuring, worth by name, by appearance, by association, suddenly found themselves at a loss. Because what had just unfolded didn't fit into any of their neat categories. She hadn't confronted them. She hadn't tried to change their minds. Instead, she let the music speak for her, and in doing so, she didn't just change the tone of the evening, she transformed the atmosphere. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of realization. Something had shifted. No words were spoken, but expressions changed. Eyes softened. Some lowered in shame. Others remained fixed on her, not in scrutiny now, but in quiet admiration. The same people who had barely acknowledged her presence were now captivated, not because they were told to be, but because the truth they'd just witnessed couldn't be ignored. Even those who had once carried an air of certainty now sat uncertain. Because what do you say when someone you underestimated reveals something so vast, so moving, that it leaves no room for rebuttal? How do you respond when a person you dismissed delivers something that leaves you changed? Karoline finally looked up, not defiantly, not triumphantly, but peacefully. She hadn't come to prove anything, but she had, in her own way, created a reckoning. A moment where those who had once questioned her found themselves silently questioned instead. A few clapped, hesitantly at first, then more joined. But it was no longer the typical applause reserved for performance. It was something different, more personal, more vulnerable. It was applause that came from the heart, not from expectation. It didn't explode, it unfolded, like people awakening from a long-held assumption and suddenly realizing how wrong they'd been. She stood, nodded softly, and walked back into the audience. There was no curtain call, no spotlight following her steps, and yet all eyes remained on her, not out of spectacle, but out of newfound respect. The silence that had filled the room moments earlier didn't just mark the end of a performance. It marked the end of a narrative, the one in which she had been cast aside, underestimated, dismissed. That story had closed. A new one had begun, not with words, not with titles, but with the quiet, undeniable power of authenticity. Long after the music stopped and the crowd dispersed, the moment lingered, not just in the air, but in the hearts of everyone who had been there. Something had happened in that hall, something rare, and it wasn't the kind of thing that could be summarized in a headline or captured in a highlight reel. It was deeper, quieter, and far more lasting. Karoline hadn't just sat at the piano and played. She had rewritten the entire atmosphere with nothing but honesty and grace. There had been no announcement, no build-up to her performance. No one handed her an invitation or gave her permission. She had simply recognized the moment and stepped into it. With her head high and her heart open, she brought a presence that wasn't loud, but impossible to ignore. In a world obsessed with credentials and spotlights, she reminded everyone that the most powerful voices often come from those who don't ask to be heard. They just speak when it matters. Her performance wasn't about ego or proving anyone wrong. It wasn't rooted in bitterness or the need for revenge. There was no trace of malice in her music, only clarity. What made it so powerful was its sincerity. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply telling the truth through her art. And that truth landed more powerfully than any argument or rebuttal ever could. After the final note, she didn't linger on stage waiting for applause. She didn't bow dramatically or bask in attention. She gave everything she had to the moment, and when it was done, she let it go. That too said something about her. Real greatness doesn't cling to recognition. It doesn't need to be seen, it needs only to be expressed. People talked about it long after, though most struggled to explain exactly why it had moved them so deeply. Some said it was the way she played with emotion, as if the piano were an extension of her soul. Others pointed to to the contrast between the skepticism before and the reverence after. But what truly struck them was the why behind it all. She hadn't played to rise above anyone else, she played to be true to herself, and in doing so, she elevated everyone around her. That night became more than just a concert, it became a lesson. A quiet but unforgettable reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits silently at a piano and tells a story no one was expecting to hear. Sometimes it wears a simple dress, walks with humility, and speaks through keys instead of microphones. And people listened, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't help it. That's the thing about truth. When it's delivered with heart, it cuts through noise like light through fog. It doesn't push, it invites. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it. And Karoline had done just that, without ever raising her voice. In that performance, she didn't just share music, she shared a part of herself. A part that had known struggle, had faced judgment, had stood in rooms that didn't welcome her and stayed anyway. She showed that dignity doesn't require permission. That strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about standing tall in who you are, even when others try to shrink you. And in a hall filled with people who had expected one kind of brilliance, they received another, one that couldn't be packaged, labeled, or compared. What Karoline offered was something timeless, the kind of performance that doesn't fade after the applause dies down, but stays with you, echoing quietly in the places that matter most. She had no need to remind anyone of what she'd done. She didn't need to speak about it afterward, or relive it through stories. The moment had spoken for itself. And for those who witnessed it, it wasn't just unforgettable, it was transformative. Because once you've heard truth played that beautifully, you don't forget the sound of it. As the lights dimmed and the last of the guests filtered out, what remained in that concert hall was more than just echoes of a melody. It was a lasting imprint of authenticity. Karoline Leavitt hadn't arrived seeking recognition. She hadn't dressed for applause or carried herself with the weight of expectation. She simply came as herself. And in doing so, she delivered something so raw, so honest, that it reached beyond the performance and into the soul. That night, she didn't just play the piano, she played the room. She played past ego, past status, past the layers of polite skepticism. She peeled away every artificial barrier with each keystroke until all that remained was a room of people held captive by truth. Not because they were forced to listen, but because they couldn't turn away. In a world that often confuses volume for power and fame for worth, Karoline reminded everyone of a different kind of strength. The strength to stand alone without needing to shout. The strength to express without needing permission. The strength to let actions speak in a way that words never could. She didn't ask anyone to see her differently. She simply gave them no choice. Moments like that don't come often. They aren't scheduled or scripted. They arrive unexpectedly, carried on the backs of people who are brave enough to step forward, without certainty, and still give everything they have. And those moments change people, not just the ones who live them, but the ones who witness them. What Karoline did in those few minutes transcended the stage. It wasn't just about music. It was about grace in the face of mockery, purpose in the presence of doubt, and courage in the quiet. She transformed condescension into curiosity, doubt into wonder, and silence into reverence, not through force, but through presence. Long after the crowd dispersed, conversations began to shift. The narrative changed. Those who once questioned her place in that room now couldn't imagine the evening without her. And yet, she sought no validation, no headlines, no interviews. Because when you operate from a place of truth, you don't need recognition to know your worth. You already carry it with you. Karoline Leavitt's moment at the piano was more than a comeback, more than a surprise. It was a declaration. One, not shouted from podiums, but played in quiet defiance of doubt. It was proof that sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't retaliation. It's excellence. And when excellence is wrapped in humility, delivered through sincerity and offered without ego, it doesn't just silence a room, it leaves it changed forever.